The lecture hall at Harvard University had hosted countless debates, but nothing like what unfolded that night. At the center stood Professor Jonathan Mills, a towering name in American philosophy, known as much for his brilliance as for his unshakable belief that he was always the sharpest mind in the room. On October 15, 1978, he had just wrapped up a lecture dripping with subtle superiority, the kind that sounded intellectual but felt dismissive. What followed in the next 20 minutes would dismantle everything he believed about intelligence and change two lives forever. 3 weeks earlier, through Harvard's prestigious speaker series, Muhammad Ali had been invited to address students on sports and social responsibility. Fresh off reclaiming his heavyweight title after defeating Leon Spinks, Ali was at the peak of global fame. But behind the scenes, something else had been set in motion. Professor Mills had personally requested to moderate the event, not to celebrate Ali, but to challenge him. To him, Ali wasn't a thinker, he was a symbol of everything wrong with modern culture: fame mistaken for wisdom, physical strength confused with intellectual depth. At 52, Mills had built his life on logic and credentials, 7 books, prestigious academic posts, and a reputation that intimidated even his peers. In his world, knowledge came from books, not from lived experience. Then Ali walked into Sanders Theater. The room erupted. Every seat was filled, aisles crowded, walls lined with students eager to see the most famous athlete alive. Dressed simply in a black suit and silver tie, Ali didn't need to say a word to command attention. But if you looked closely, there was something different in his eyes that night, something steady, almost knowing. Mills began the introduction with polished precision, but the tone was unmistakably cold. He acknowledged Ali's achievements in boxing, but openly questioned his authority to speak on morality or social issues. The crowd shifted uneasily. This wasn't respect, it was a setup. Then came the questions. Mills turned to Ali, his voice firm, calculated. "Can you explain the philosophical foundation behind your refusal to serve in Vietnam? Which thinkers influenced your decision? What texts shaped your ethics?" The room went still. It was a trap designed to expose gaps in academic knowledge. But Ali didn't defend himself. He leaned forward slightly and asked something completely unexpected. "Professor, can I ask you something first?" Mills hesitated. "What's your favorite memory of your father?" The question landed like a shock wave. Confusion flickered across Mills's face. This wasn't part of the script. "I don't see how that relates," he replied, though his confidence had softened. "Just go with me," Ali said gently. "Tell me one moment with him that still makes you smile." Silence stretched across the hall. Then, slowly, Mills spoke.
"My father was a carpenter," he said, "not formally educated. When I was 8, he spent an entire weekend building me a tree house. He let me help, taught me how to measure properly, how to take my time. When we finished, he told me I was his best assistant." Ali nodded, listening closely. "That wasn't just about building something, was it?" he asked. "He was teaching you more than carpentry." Mills swallowed. "Yes, it was about care, about thinking before acting." Memories began to surface. The scent of wood, the quiet patience of his father, the warmth of those evenings spent together. Ali smiled. "Your father was a philosopher," he said softly. "He just didn't have a title." The room fell completely silent. "Everything he showed you, patience, attention, love, that's wisdom, real wisdom. That treehouse wasn't just wood, it was proof that you mattered. Something shifted inside Mills. For decades, he had dismissed those memories as sentimental, irrelevant to serious thought. Now, they felt undeniable. Ali stood and began walking across the stage. "You asked about my philosophy," he continued. "Let me tell you where mine comes from." He spoke of Elijah Muhammad, who taught him identity and purpose. He spoke of his mother, who worked tirelessly so her son could dream bigger than his circumstances. He spoke of courage, of people who stood for dignity without degrees, of everyday individuals who chose what was right, even when it cost them everything. "These are my teachers," Ali said, "not because of titles, but because of what they stood for." Mills felt his certainty slipping away. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure he was the smartest person in the room. And for the first time, it didn't matter. Ali stopped in front of him. "You believe there's a hierarchy," he said. "Books at the top, lived experience at the bottom. But what if wisdom doesn't work that way?" The audience was completely absorbed. Mills took a breath, his voice quieter now. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I came here believing my education made me superior. I thought I could expose you." He paused. "But I see now, I was the one hiding behind something false." He stepped away from the podium. "My father passed away 10 years ago. At his funeral, I spoke about his work, his character, but never his wisdom. I was embarrassed." The weight of that confession hung heavy. Ali placed a hand on his shoulder. "Your father would be proud of you right now, not for your titles, but for your honesty." Mills broke. Years of pride, distance, and emotional isolation collapsed all at once. "I've been alone," he admitted. "I built a life proving I was smarter than everyone else, and it left me empty." Ali pulled him into an embrace. "Knowledge without love means nothing. You don't have to live that way anymore." What followed wasn't a lecture, it was something far deeper. The planned discussion was abandoned. Instead, the two men spent the next hour talking, not as opponents, but as equals. They spoke of life, about meaning, about the many ways wisdom can exist.
The audience didn't just watch, they felt it. Students who once feared Mills saw a different man, a human being, not just a professor. One student, Jennifer Walsh, sat in disbelief as the man known for tearing apart essays showed vulnerability for the first time. Another, Marcus Johnson, found himself thinking about his grandmother, how she had taught him fairness, not through books, but through the way she treated others. The shift was everywhere. That night didn't just change Mills, it changed the room. Their connection didn't end there. It grew into a lasting friendship. Mills became one of Ali's strongest supporters, not because he abandoned academia, but because he finally understood it wasn't the only path to wisdom. He began teaching differently, sharing stories of his father, encouraging students to value the lessons learned outside classrooms. Eventually, he wrote a book inspired by that moment, exploring how real understanding comes from both study and experience. Years later, when Ali faced Parkinson's disease, Mills stood beside him, helping preserve his legacy and message. That night at Harvard became something more than an event. It became a reminder that wisdom isn't confined to degrees, that intelligence without humility becomes arrogance, and that sometimes the greatest lesson doesn't come from proving someone wrong, but from choosing to understand them instead. Years passed, but the impact of that night never faded. Professor Mills was no longer the same man who once stood behind that podium with quiet superiority. Something fundamental had shifted, not just in how he saw others, but in how he understood himself. In his lectures at Harvard University, the tone changed.
Gone were the cold, detached analyses that left students intimidated. In their place came stories, real human stories. He began speaking about his father openly, not as a footnote, but as a teacher in his own right. The greatest lesson I ever learned, Professor Mills would tell his students, didn't come from a philosopher. It came from a man with a hammer and a handful of nails. At first, students were surprised. This wasn't the professor they had heard about, the one who demanded perfection and dismissed anything that didn't meet his rigid standards. This version of Mills listened more, asked questions, left space for voices that once would have been ignored. And slowly, the classroom transformed. Students who once feared speaking began to share their own experiences. Conversations became deeper, more honest. Philosophy was no longer just theory. It became something alive, something personal. Mills had finally understood what Muhammad Ali tried to show him that night, that wisdom isn't proven, it's lived. Outside the university, their friendship continued to grow. What started as a confrontation had turned into mutual respect, then something even stronger. They stayed in touch, meeting whenever their paths crossed, each conversation building on the last. Mills often reflected on that evening, replaying it in his mind, not as a moment of embarrassment, but as the moment he was set free.
Years later, when Ali's voice began to quiet under the weight of Parkinson's disease, Mills stood beside him, not as a scholar analyzing a public figure, but as a friend protecting a legacy. He helped organize discussions, supported initiatives, and spoke passionately about Ali's impact, not just in sports, but in shaping how people understood courage, identity, and truth. Ali didn't just fight in the ring, Mills once said during a lecture. He fought for the right to define himself, and in doing so, he gave others permission to do the same. Back at Harvard, a small plaque was eventually placed inside Sanders Theater, not to celebrate a victory, not to honor a title, but to remember a moment when two completely different worlds collided, and instead of conflict, something extraordinary emerged. Students would walk past it every day, many unaware of the full story behind it, but those who knew understood. They knew it marked the night a professor lost his certainty and found something far more valuable: humility, connection, truth. Because in the end, what happened on that stage wasn't about proving who was smarter. It was about discovering that intelligence alone isn't enough, that knowledge, no matter how vast, can still leave a person empty if it's not grounded in something deeper, and that sometimes the most powerful lessons don't come from speaking, they come from listening.
Students who once feared Professor Mills saw a different side of him, one that was open, emotional, real. One student, Jennifer Walsh, couldn't believe what she was seeing. The same professor who had once pushed her to rewrite papers over and over was now showing vulnerability. Another student, Marcus Johnson, found himself thinking about his grandmother, how she taught him fairness through her actions, not through theory. The change wasn't just on stage, it spread through the entire room. That night became something unforgettable. What was meant to be a moment of embarrassment turned into something powerful. A realization that wisdom doesn't belong to one group, that intelligence isn't measured only by degrees. The connection between Ali and Mills didn't end there. It grew into a lasting friendship. Mills began teaching differently, blending academic theory with real-life experience. He spoke about his father often, sharing those lessons with students who had never considered that wisdom could exist outside books. He even wrote a book inspired by that transformation, exploring how knowledge and life experience can exist side by side. Years later, when Ali faced Parkinson's disease, Mills stood beside him, supporting efforts to preserve his message and legacy. The man who once doubted him had become one of his strongest advocates. The lesson from that night never faded. Real wisdom recognizes truth no matter where it comes from, whether it's found in a classroom or in a simple moment between a father and his child. Because intelligence without humility becomes arrogance. But when intelligence is guided by compassion, it becomes something truly powerful. Today, Sanders Theater still remembers that night, not because of a debate won or lost, but because two men discovered something deeper. One tried to tear the other down. Instead, he found himself rebuilt. And the man who could have responded with pride chose something far greater: understanding.